A very warm welcome to all of you to another Urbanism lunch hour. Those of you who are more regular attendees to these sessions will remember that our last couple of events focused on transport issues. Today, we shift them to a completely different field, and that is that of planning. We all have our views about the government's recent attempts to change parts of the planning system, and note that I was trying to be BBC neutral by saying views rather than concerns. But we hope that we will explore some of these changes and get your own comments and reaction to the two presentations that we have from two fantastic planning solicitors. Simon Ricketts is someone I have known for well over 20 years, and I've always thought of him as a brilliant professional. That is a view that has been shared by Planning Magazine's annual survey, which has ranked Simon as the country's most highly rated planning solicitor for the past 11 years. He was head of planning and environmental law at S.J. Berwin before founding Town Legal just over 4 years ago. Duncan is also a partner at Town Legal, and he advises on infrastructure projects and regeneration schemes around the UK. His clients include the Crown Estate, London City Airport, and Defence Infrastructure Organisation. It would be remiss of me not to mention that Duncan has been on cloud 9 over the last few weeks because his beloved Liverpool have won the Premiership after waiting to do so for over 30 years. With that, I'd like to give the floor to Simon.
Well, thanks very much, Andreas. Really good to be here. So we originally were thinking about talking about zoning, but then with all of the changes underway that Andreas was mentioning, we thought we'd broaden it out slightly. So next slide, please. Andreas, this slide is for you in particular. Of course, it's Delphi, where the high priestess, known as the Pythia, served as the oracle. You knew that. I had to look it up in Google. And that came to mind because when we were going to do this presentation at the very end of July, we thought we might actually see the government's planning policy paper, which had been promised for July. And that paper has been trailed by Robert Jenrick as setting out proposals for radical and comprehensive reform of the English planning system. So ahead of that document, I'm not sure if Duncan and I are here as oracles or as human sacrifices to you gods of planning and urbanism, but let's see how we go. Next slide, please. So life as a planning lawyer used to be, shall we say, pedestrian, but it's not at present. In fact, it's sort of slightly surreal. As I mentioned, Duncan and I were originally proposing to unpick what Robert Jenrick may have in mind with his much trailed move towards a more zone-based approach to planning. And Duncan will certainly cover that in the second part of this presentation, the zoning in part. But I wanted to say a few words about the more recent planning flexibilities given by way of changes to the General Permitted Development Order and the Use Classes Order, because we shouldn't see these as distinct from the debate that we're just about to have in relation to zone-based planning. And I say that because, you know, when we think about what a zoning approach is, well, I'd say that it's the setting of a detailed legal regime which allows development to come forward with largely depoliticized and light touch checks as to whether the specific proposal is consistent with the zoning plan or scheme and meets specified technical requirements. And that zoning scheme conceptually might be by way of a detailed zoning plan or code, or in some instances it might be by way of a regulatory code set by the state, such as, by way of the GPDO and use classes order. So in a way, the two are interlinked. Next slide, please. So this is the zoning out part. And next slide. So for a long time, obviously, the government has been trying to remove more routine forms of development from the traditional planning applications system. And, we all have views on that, but it's topical to look at the recent changes to the General Permitted Development Order, because pretty quickly, the view I come to is that when you look at the criteria which have to be set out as to whether a particular development right is to apply, when you look at the prior approval requirements that are then imposed and the subjectivity of a number of those requirements, and then when you look at the conditions which either are automatically applied by operation of the order or which may be applied by the local authority, in many instances, most advantages over the traditional planning application process, I would say, are removed. I'd certainly say that was the case in relation to the recent permitted development rights to extend upwards up to 2 floors from existing dwellings and from purpose-built blocks of flats, and also the permitted development right to demolish commercial buildings and replace with residential. The civil servants, I suspect, have done a very good job in backfilling from ministers' intentions for a long time to include these permitted development rights in the GPDO by introducing necessary checks and balances. But those checks and balances really negate the purpose, to my view, of having the permitted development right in the first instance. And so my prediction is that these rights are not going to be used to a significant extent. And this is not equivalent to the uptake we saw when office to residential was introduced as a permitted development right, which when introduced had relatively light touch criteria before it could apply, and a limited set of prior approval requirements, all of which were pretty objective rather than relying on subjective issues of judgment about, say, external appearance or effect on amenity. And I'm saying this because, if you think that this tick box approach in the permitted development order is complicated, and at Town we've prepared a flowchart which seeks to take you through the criteria, the prior approval requirements, the conditions. If you think all that's complicated, then basically wait until you see a zoning scheme. If we go on to the next slide, please. So then I wanted to go on to the use classes order changes, and I put into Google that I wanted a picture of a sort of office, a shop turned into an office, and I thought Google did a pretty good job here. As we all now know, provide for a new combined use class E, which brings together B1, the A classes, and much of C1, much of D1, and that may be a signal of how radical the government is prepared to be in the changes which it announces next week. Certainly the inclusion of the B1 was perhaps a surprise to many of us. obviously some updating and additional flexibility was overdue in relation to the use classes order, given changes in shopping patterns and the differing ways in which space is now occupied. But it does seem to me as if the unintended consequences are queuing up. Retail shed to call centre, rural office complex to retail outlet centre, retail high street to a row of solicitors' offices. It's all waved through. Again, the headline flexibility may not turn out to be all that it seems, in that many existing planning permissions would already contain conditions switching off the ability to rely on the use classes order. We've seen that traditionally in relation to retail parks, for example, where the ability to rely on A1 to go from non-food to food is often switched off. But it's going to be pretty random as to where there are those conditions and where there aren't. And there isn't also any guidance yet in terms of planning practice guidance from the government as to the approach that local authorities should take on new applications for planning permission. Will they routinely disapply the order if you apply for Class E consent, for example? But where the freedom does apply, I mean, what actually happens is just going to be left to the market and to the position taken by landlords. It's an obvious question, but what role is there now for local planning authority policy making on town centres, on retail, on employment? I think we are definitely going to see some very quick and very significant changes given the precarious position of many retail and F&B chains. And what of office values where you can use almost anywhere as your workspace? And watching the news last night, I suppose the other thing I'd say is the public has got limited bandwidth to take on board some of this stuff. And I was watching the news last night about the sad descent in the closure by TUI of I think 12 travel agents, and I was just looking at the images of those units thinking they could now go overnight to almost anything. We're in an unpredictable world, and obviously part of that is in line with the government's fear that it needs to do something to ensure that entrepreneurship and enterprise delivers jobs, but it certainly doesn't do much for sort of the curation of space. Another slide, please, Stephen. I only included this slide because it just sort of struck me that one definite trend in recent years has been the breaking down of distinctions between different sorts of use. And I had to look at this slide for a little while before I sort of worked out whether I was looking at an office, whether I was looking at a coffee bar, or whether I was looking at a furniture shop. It's right that we should be looking again at the use classes order. I just worry about whether further checks and balances should have been included. And then my final slide, Stephen, please. It seems a long time ago. I was sitting here during that session when Robert Jenrick introduced the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission report, and he spoke so enthusiastically about the government's support for the work of the Commission. It just seems that that has been going on in a completely different part of the forest to the GPDO and use classes order changes I've been mentioning, and indeed to a lot of the deregulation that I suspect we'll be seeing trailed next week. I just find it very difficult to see how this beauty strand is going to be woven in with the other policy priorities that we are going to see. And I think even the Oracle at Delphi would have zoned out at that point, which is an awkward way into Duncan's half of this presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. Duncan, would you like to go straight in?
Yes, please. Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yes, so I thought I'd start the zoning in part of the presentation with just a brief reminder of what we mean when we say zoning or land use zoning. And at a very general level, it's the designation by local government of different zones for different land uses and types of buildings, often but not exclusively in cities, and typically in most instances it involves the separation or deliberate distribution of uses across the city, residential, mixed use, commercial, industrial and special uses such as manufacturing or other heavy industrial processes. And often, if you kind of look around some of the experiences of zoning in other parts of the world, you know, there's often a tension between delivering the certainty that a zoning system can give you and the resulting inflexibility that sometimes the zoning system produces, because you would come forward with a proposal that doesn't match what the zoning authority planned for. I think also another tension which you can pick up, particularly in the US, is this tension between vision. I mean, zoning is a very powerful tool to deliver a vision for a city, as against entrenchment, entrenchment of opportunities, inequalities, and even discrimination by detailed requirements, for example, for density, which may limit the supply of housing for certain groups. If we go on to the next slide. But standing back from what zoning is understood to be around the world, it's worth just looking at recent references to zoning by the government and parties close to the government. So we had the Planning for the Future white paper, policy paper, which was produced in March by the government, and there was a commitment to expanding the use of zoning tools to support development. It gave an example actually of an existing concept, which I'll come on to later, local development order, but it didn't go into a great deal more detail. But we have had two reports from the Policy Exchange, which is close to number 10, and as some will know, one individual there, Jack Airy, has joined 10 Downing Street as a special advisor, and those documents have also had some endorsement from the Secretary of State, Robert Jenrick. So worth looking briefly at those. In Planning Anew, we had a collection of essays on reforming the planning system for the 21st century, and amid those was an essay which was somewhat futuristic in its approach by David Rudlin, and centered on this idea of plot-based urbanism, which essentially consisted of 3 tiers of policy making: national spatial plan, a regional level plan, and then local zones or codes for development to come forward. In the other document, Rethinking the Planning System for the 21st Century, this was more of a far-reaching assessment of the need for reform of the planning system. And within that, there was a recommendation, Jack Airy was one of the authors, for a binary zonal land use planning system to be introduced, which simply would differentiate between land that could be developed and land that should not be developed. This would be accompanied by a rules-based development control system. In other words, if your proposals accorded with the rules, then you would be able to go ahead. And if they didn't accord with the rules, you would not be able to go ahead. And those rules would be set out in local plans, which would only deal with the form, layout of development and site-specific protections, such as heritage issues that might need to be addressed. And also quite important in this discussion was the proposal to limit the role of politicians simply to that local plan process and simply to the form of development that would come forward, not the fact of development. and certainly not any involvement in the development control level. On to the next slide, please. So just looking around the world, I thought it would be helpful to take two examples. One, New York, in terms of what a zoning system looks like, and one in Victoria, Australia, to look at what sort of legal framework might be necessary to put a zoning system in place in the UK. So firstly, in New York, where I think it's right to say zoning began in the States, in the New York City zoning system, which is quite voluminous as I understand it, it generally looks at 4 categories of uses, with the potential to have some mix of uses as well, i.e. commercial, manufacturing, residential and special purpose. Alongside that, there are very detailed set of codes for the bulk of development, which list multiple factors which shape the form of development that can come forward on individual zoned plots, including floor to area ratio, i.e. how much floor area you can develop for the size of the plot that you have, density requirements, height restrictions, setbacks from the streets, various provisions around parking and plazas. They include bonus incentives, so that if you deliver features that are considered to be for the public good, such as public realm or spaces, the developer can have an additional allowance for development to increase floor area, for example. There are opportunities for the zoning authority to introduce overlays and special provisions to deal with particular issues in neighbourhoods, such as heritage or environmental requirements. But it is fundamentally an as of right system. In other words, if you see a plot of land which is zoned, you can more or less determine what you will be allowed to build there, and it will be your right to build there, subject to a separate system of building control. There is some opportunity for flexibility within that, but it's pretty rare as I understand it. So there is the concept of the city being able to issue zoning variance permits. And there is also the longer process of rezoning an area, which is also possible under that system. Turning to the legal framework, I chose Victoria, Australia, because Australia is much closer to us in terms of the legal system that operates there. And for their zoning system, they have a primary act of parliament, which sets out the structure of the zoning system, enabling powers for zoning authorities and their duties. There are then a series of regulations and ministerial directions which concern the implementation of that system, the form and content of planning schemes which individual local authorities are expected to adopt. Quite a lot of standardization in those schemes as well, so there is familiarity between local authority areas in terms of what the zoning system looks like, and of course procedures for bringing forward proposals. There is then the provision for local authorities to bring forward their individual planning schemes using, as I said, standard provisions, but also the ability to introduce local provisions into the planning or zoning scheme. And alongside that, in parallel, you have national planning policy framework and local planning policy frameworks. And I think one conclusion to draw from this is that you can readily see how a zoning system isn't necessarily straightforward. It isn't necessarily the binary option that the Policy Exchange suggested in their paper, and in fact can be quite detailed, quite a lot of regulation, and quite a complex legal structure in order to deliver it. If we move on to the next slide, I mean, I would suggest if we are looking at zoning, and I think it does have a role to play in the planning system, we might well look to the US for some inspiration, but not in the same sense as we've just seen on the previous slides. And there I've highlighted a quote from Theodore Roosevelt: "Do what you can with what you have where you are." And if we look at some of the tools that already exist in our system, we have enterprise zones and simplified planning zones, which have been with us for some time, actually, and were heavily used, as some of you will know, in the 1980s, and endured for quite a long time, delivering significant change. One of the primary examples of which is Canary Wharf and the whole Isle of Dogs area. Local development orders have been with us for about 15 years, pretty much underutilised, but they can grant conditional planning permission over a geographic area for development specified in the order. And the London Gateway Logistics Park LDO is a very good example of this. It can contain quite a detailed parameters for height and other physical form of development, design codes, management plans, a system of prior notification to the local planning authority, and provision for planning obligations, even draft Section 106 agreements. So you can pretty much establish over a physical extent of an area the form of development and that you want to see come forward, and how that should come forward as well. And finally, we also have a concept called permission in principle, which has only partially been enacted, introduced in the Housing and Planning Act 2016. This is designed to give what it says on the tin, really, permission in principle for development, subject to approval of technical details. And it was intended to be a lighter touch way of securing permission for development, lighter touch than, say, an outline planning permission or a full planning permission. And it's been enacted for both small scale residential applications up to 10 housing units, and for land included in brownfield land registers. But there is a third limb which has not been enacted, and that is that it can be granted for land allocated in development plans. And there you have the perfect gateway, in my opinion, towards introducing some form of zoning in the UK. All of these tools have their limitations. So, for example, at the moment, in terms of what has been enacted, permission in principle can't be granted for EIA development requiring environmental impact assessment. A local development order can't be granted for Schedule 1 EIA development, the really large-scale, dirty industrial uses that are listed in that schedule, which will always require an environmental impact assessment. And an enterprise zone scheme or a simplified planning zone cannot at the moment be granted for EIA development. But those are limitations which it would be possible to lift in any decision by the government to make the best use of what we have to introduce some form of zoning. But we are, of course, on the lookout for what the government really means by zoning, and we'll promise that next week. So in the next slide. We all need to keep a lookout for changes to come. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Duncan. Thank you to both Duncan and Simon for two very thorough, comprehensive, and stimulating presentations. Lots of food for thought there. I'm going to exercise the chair's prerogative and ask the first question of our two speakers. You both mentioned the word politics. I just wanted to hear from your own experience whether you think there is too much politics or too little in the planning system and decision making. Who wants to go first?
Shall I start and then Duncan will think of the right answer while I babble? That's how it usually works. Well, planning is inherently political because, the whole process of planning is surely interventions into the market and society by government and on behalf of government for the public benefit, rather than allowing the free market to do what it would otherwise do. So of course planning is political. I suppose the question is whether you can at all funnel the political decision making to fewer stages in the process, because I suppose my concern is at the moment you do have the land allocation stage. So you have big bust up over the local plan, very political. Then you have outline planning permission, big bust up, very political. And then you have reserve matters stage, lengthy, probably not so political. But whether those first two stages could, whether you need those two stages in that way, or perhaps with a slower or more detailed sort of policy making stage, you might be able to depoliticize to a greater extent the decision making stage. I suppose that must be at the root of what the government must be thinking it's going to achieve by a zone-based system. But I'll now wait.
Thank you. Duncan, do you agree? Do you have any other views?
Yeah, I think I do. I mean, I think we have to accept an element of politics in any system that's founded on democratic principles, which is what our system is founded on. I do think we revisit the principle of development too often, and even past the point when the principle of development has been decided, and that is where politics comes into it. But I think it's easy to blame politics. I think another key issue in our system is resources. Even with political presence in decision making, if there were more resources available to local authorities, I think we'd see the system operate far more efficiently.
Okay, thank you. In his answer, Simon mentioned the public interest, and there was in fact a question about who is protecting the public interest from Kevin Murray. Kevin, would you like to come in, please, and ask your question?
Yes, good morning. Sorry, good afternoon. The question was really that it looks like the shift is very much about a permissive one that's rights-based, but there are sometimes wider interests, community, neighborhood, heritage, and so on, who acts in terms of the public interest, and is all that embedded in the codes? And I see there are examples being fed in about the overlays coming into existence in places like Boston. So that actually over time, it becomes more negotiative and less straightforward. So it's really, how is the public interest served through this kind of mechanism?
Yeah, I mean, I think you inevitably have to, you fall back on the original zoning concept or the original zoning scheme as the place where the public interest should be protected. And I think that's fine in theory, and perhaps is one solution to the regularity with which politics comes into the planning system, i.e. it will come into play then and only then, in theory. But I think you're right to identify how that could be deteriorating over time. When you have zoning systems which perhaps entrench values or entrench particular ideas at one particular moment in time, and in order to remain up to date would have to be regularly revised. And we all know just with our own local plan system that just doesn't happen. And so you do get, you probably do get, I'm not familiar with Boston, but the type of scenario that you outlined, you do get instances where change occurs, but not with the benefit of strategic overview and a reassessment of public interest, but simply really on an opportunistic basis, which is where that system would begin to deteriorate.
Okay, can I bring in Pam Alexander, who's got a very interesting question about digital skills, and then after Pam we'll have Bilana, who has reminded all of us about the Localism Act. So first, Pam. Oh.
Hi, everybody. I think I'm okay now, am I?
Yeah, you are.
I was interested, sorry if you can hear the lawnmower, I'll move, in whether you have any thoughts about how the increase in digital skills through this great series of webinars that everybody is doing, but also the broader engagement provided by online planning committees. I chair the planning committee at London Legacy Development Corporation. How do you think this broader reach will affect these changes? I was particularly struck that Simon thinks the public will simply get increasingly skeptical that engagement planning is worth doing at all.
Okay, Simon?
I mean, certainly we've all, and I'm sure the public generally has got much more familiar with engaging through various digital forms, particularly through this period. But I think there are much more exciting opportunities that the I can't remember what the catapult is now called, but you know, the government's work on
Connected places. I'm on the board.
Oh right, well.
But actually, Plantech's exactly what digital engagement's all about. You know, we're getting people who would never come to workshops or get involved in surveys, just watching what's going on and then engaging. So I do think it's exciting. I don't think it's in any way exclusive of all the traditional and improved ways of engaging, but I think we need to be considering how we get behind it, because it's getting a lot more people watching what's going on.
I agree, and investing in making, if you sit down and read, for example, the GPDO, it's almost impossible, but if you convert it into a flowchart or a digital tool where you can visualize what is actually allowed and what's not, it's probably a much more straightforward process than the black box, which is the discretionary sort of planning application system. So, you know, there must be, if we are going to move to a more sort of regulated zoning based system, that has got to be hand in hand with real investment in making this straightforward and easily accessible for everyone. I wholly agree.
Okay, I don't know, Bilana is on her mobile phone. I don't know if you're able to come in, Bilana, or should I ask you a question?
Yeah, I'll try.
Oh, okay.
I'll try. Hi, Simon. My question was about localism. It's not that long ago that we all worked on localism and supporting neighbourhood planning, and it seems to me that with all these latest changes, the government is very much moving away from localism. Is this the slow death of localism, is my question, because it's been already very difficult in my local area in London to have any control, any say over what's happening with the permitted development rights. We've lost so many community facilities already, and this is going to just make it even worse.
There's been almost total silence recently from the government in terms of references to neighbourhood planning, it seems to me, and often they use, you know, terms like local communities and other ways of expressing that sort of, you know, that neighbourhood level. So yeah, I totally agree, and it's difficult to see how neighbourhood planning would knit with this sort of zoning approach. Yeah, but I agree.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's really difficult to see how neighbourhood plannings can have any meaning, you know, with extended permitted development rights, because most of the neighbourhood planning is about, you know, high streets and that kind of very local, small scale changes and mixed use. So I'm not very hopeful.
Yeah,
there is some reference to neighbourhood plans in the policy exchange paper, rethinking the planning system for the 21st century, but it is relegated to you know, even below local plan level in terms of coming forward with codes for the form of development that the local community wants to see, not the type of development or where that development should take place. So
yeah.
Yep. Okay, is David Radlen with us today? I ask because he was referenced by Duncan earlier on, and I was going to give you the opportunity, David, if you're there, to ask a question. No? In that case, we'll move on to...
Sorry, Andreas, I am here.
Oh, there you are. Okay.
I was keeping my counsel because, as some of you know, that we've been appointed to work with the government on the National Urban Design Code, the Model Code, which fits in with all this agenda. And as part of that, I'm not really allowed to voice my own opinion.
Okay, that's fine. Fully understood, David. You just sit here and listen to these very interesting points raised by others. Can I bring in Carlos Soto, who has experience in Latin America of different zoning systems? Carlos? Is Carlos there? Can you hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay. Would you like to ask you a question, please?
Oh, well, no. What I was wondering is because, of course, my experience had been in these cities that, yeah, in Latin America, most of, I think all of our cities are under zoning-based planning systems, and it takes so long to approve plans, to give, to make modifications, to even small-scale master plans, neighborhood plans. Everything is so hard to manage. And when I came to the UK, something I found, at least with the dynamics of approvals, planning applications and all that, is it goes faster. Of course, there is a different economic context and it's a different cultural context, but yet it brought to my mind that comparison that I see here more versatility. And when I just started reading this news about potential modifications and wondering if zoning-based planning system could fit in UK, I was like, okay, this is seriously. I was wondering what were the benefits or what these ideas or the people proposing the idea of turning into zoning-based have in their minds, or what would be the benefits they see. Maybe they are, or maybe there is a balance between your current planning system, like more place-based, and the coding and zoning system that, from my experience, of course, I'm not, as I said at the end of my comment, I'm a young planner, I'm not that experienced in development management. But yeah, I mean, for me, it's, I just wonder what would be the actual benefits, or maybe there is a middle point in between these two systems that could actually make things better.
Duncan, I mean, you spoke about international experience as well. Would you like to take this one?
Yes, I mean, I think the government's motivation is primarily around more certainty and speed in the planning system, and attracting, as a result, more investment and delivery, particularly of homes, and actually now increasingly economic growth. That's their motivation. I think it's well intentioned, but I do think you have a good point around, you know, in reality how a full-scale zoning system would work, and whether actually we would find ourselves with less flexibility over time, because, you know, these things, as we mentioned earlier, would have to be revisited frequently. And I do think a halfway house of the sort that I alluded to in the last but one slide that I had, utilising existing tools which effectively do deliver a form of zoning in particular areas, you know, could be the way forward, because it would, if those tools were encouraged more, it would give us some experience of zoning without throwing everything out in one go, and it would also allow very, you know, focused zoning initiatives to take place in areas which were particularly in need of that approach, rather than trying to persuade every local authority up and down the country to adopt a zoning scheme.
Thank you, Duncan. David Lamb, there was a very laconic question from David. David, are you there?
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can.
Yep.
Fire away.
You can see me now. I was just provoked, really, to think we have this initiative to promote beauty in our neighbourhood spaces, places and architecture. I think a government-sponsored or promoted or supported, at least, initiative to go for beauty. But at the same time, this relaxation in what can be permitted in development on high streets is really a recipe for absolute, expletive, deleted disaster. And I just cannot fathom how we're talking about a government that can promote and talk about these two extremes. What is the, how on earth? I mean, I know it's a political question, but what can we do as urbanists to to try and square this rather broken circle.
Okay. Well, if urbanists do not know the answer, let's see if two people from the legal profession might help us. So Duncan and Simon, do you have an answer for David?
Well, I don't have an answer to the wider question, but I suppose what the government would say is in relation to the GPDO changes, then it's true that within the requirements for prior approval are approval to the external appearance and the design of the proposed extension and the replacement building in the case of commercial being replaced by residential, and references to amenity of neighbouring businesses and residents. But I would say, first of all, that's a limited remit for an authority, because the principle of the development has to be taken as a given. Secondly, it's a recipe for dispute between authority, community, and developer as to whether the authority is being too negative and prescriptive, or is being soft and rolling over, because there's no real because there's no real objective way of determining whether what the right approach should be in relation to prior approval. And thirdly, going beyond that, design is one thing. If we're going to move, as the Commission is suggesting, to beefing up the NPPF to talk about beauty in addition to design, I do regard those things as different, and it's going to be increasingly difficult if we're going to be trying to determine in the planning process whether development should be refused for not being beautiful. But that's probably a wider question.
Yeah, thank you, Simon. We're going to move to Janet now, Janet Sutherland, who has a very specific question about housing for older people. Janet?
Well, my question was about the how on earth we actually grab the opportunity that we've got with repurposing some of the unwanted, sorry, kill my phone, how we repurpose the unwanted properties in our town centres to make sure that we use them to provide some of the much needed accommodation for older people. And I'm particularly motivated because sorry, I was just distracted by a phone call coming through there. I've been engaged with my local U3A and recently did a monthly talk by Zoom, and did a Zoom poll. And I was really interested with the results, because a phenomenal number of people were interested in co-housing schemes, others in a smaller number in retirement housing, but more than we produce, because 5% of people currently live in retirement housing. 11% of my audience were interested in it. But really, there are incredible opportunities to do things with these town centre buildings. But if all the developers will be chasing their tiny little 15 square metre, 19 square metre permitted development, little flatlets, we're not going to have much chance. So it was really just how do we actually, any ideas from the panel about how we can grasp the opportunities that should be presented?
In my view, the use classes order changes, make all of this more challenging, because they're going to, the changes increase the value of, redundant commercial space that would otherwise perhaps have been able to be viably developed, whether for older people's housing or for any other, socially beneficial uses. So quite apart from the physical development, and actual changes of use which may occur directly as a result of the use classes order, we also have to have an eye on what the introduction of the changes mean for values of individual property and their availability for other uses. Are those uses going to be priced out? Because I could open up a branch of our solicitors firm in a vacant unit on the high street, rather than it going to something that was more beneficial.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that I think with that in mind, local authorities are probably having to fall back on other policy changes or financial incentives such as changes to community infrastructure levy and so on to try to encourage the type of development that they would want to see come forward in those sorts of buildings that you're talking about, which could involve, although they may not have a great deal of control in terms of development control over those buildings, surrounding infrastructure and surrounding uses which they actively encourage and help to deliver might shape the type of development that comes forward, but you're very much, as Simon says, in the hands of commercial interests.
Okay. Claire St. Martin, a question about delivery of housing in general. Claire?
Hi. I just really wanted to get the opinion from Simon and Duncan about whether this is going to speed things up in terms of delivery of housing or actually slow things down, and would it also enable us to ensure that housing is in the right place and that social infrastructure is in the right place as well? Or will town centres lose the opportunity to safeguard space for social infrastructure?
Okay.
If I answer it from the GPDO and UCO perspective, and then Duncan wider in terms of zoning, there's nothing in the recent GPDO and use classes order changes, in my view, that will accelerate the development of housing. As I say, I think the permitted development rights are so constrained as not to really make much of a difference, although the government has projected that 41,000 additional homes could be produced according to their impact assessment by the permitted development order changes, which I just don't get. But it has been flagged in the explanatory notes to the use classes order that there will be further changes to the GPDO in due course before next July. And I'm assuming that that will update current GPDO rights, which at the moment deal with, for example, office to residential, light industrial to an extent to residential, etc., and will start to guide what permitted development rights attached to Class E property to be converted to residential, because there's nothing in when we look at surplus department stores and other large retail units, there's nothing in this package of measures which allows easy conversion to residential. So I'd say nothing at the moment, but I expect.
Thank you, Simon. Sorry, I'm just mindful of the time. We've only got 5 minutes left, and lots of more questions coming. We may not have time to cover all of them. Can I ask Joanna Chambers to ask her question about proper engagement and the role of institutions towards the proposed changes? Joanna? So I'll ask Joanna's question of Simon and Duncan.
Yeah,
oh, you're there.
Can
okay.
You hear me? Yes.
Yep. Fire away, Joanna.
Oh, just a minute. Sorry. Oh, hi. No, I'm just very conscious of the fact that this is one occasion where all of the institutes are being united in their concerns about the impacts of the changes. There doesn't seem to be very much of a dialogue going on, and there certainly hasn't been very much in the way of consultation on the changes. And I'm just wondering how this might pan out going forward if more changes are proposed. How do the institutions actually get a voice at the table? Because it doesn't seem to be happening at the moment.
Okay. Duncan, how do you think we can all get together and make a difference and try and influence how these changes go forward?
I think it's probably about the institutions starting to get more on the front foot and actually engaging directly in anticipation of change with the government and the department. I think lack of consultation, you know, is probably a sign of things to come if we read the runes correctly. You know, there will be guidance and policy that goes along with the changes that we've seen already, but it isn't there yet, and that's perhaps a window of opportunity for institutes to try to influence. But of course, you have to have in mind the politics, and you know, it has to be a positive engagement, i.e., you know, we accept these changes, but we need to make them work better,
okay,
and to ensure they have some degree of permanence rather than having to be changed again later for adverse consequences.
Thank you. Thanks, Duncan. I'm going to give the very last question to Nicholas Falk, about publicly owned land. Over to you, Nicholas.
Kind of you. I would like to see the extent to which we can achieve other objectives through other means, through rules. I like the idea of rules because they introduce clarity. But will it be possible to say, for example, that different forms of procurement can take place on publicly owned land or publicly owned land that's pooled, or land which happens to be highly accessible, for example, within a half a mile of a railway station? And how does this relate to the general issue of achieving affordable housing? Is the argument that you don't try and achieve affordable housing through the planning system, or will it still be possible to say that a balanced community, at least on a major development site, will actually create something that's much more valuable in the fullest sense over the long term?
Okay, very big question. So Simon and Duncan, you've got a minute each to answer it, please.
Affordable housing irrelevant for GPDO, one of the great problems with that. Public land, great opportunity, not just for the state, but for all major landowners to ensure that great places are created through the controls they impose on their tenants, quite separate from the planning system, back to the great estates of Georgian times. Who knows? And
Duncan?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that zoning does allow you probably more scope to determine you know, what quantity of affordable housing should be delivered and where. Of course, that only works if you keep it refreshed, because you will have a view at a moment in time, and that view will change. I think zoning also, however, does lead you more in the direction of financial tariffs rather than actual delivery, and therefore we could start to see, you know, affordable housing funds which the public sector then uses to deliver rather than the developer delivering.
Okay, thank you. And before I let you go, I was challenged by Simon with his reference to the Oracle at Delphi. So I'm going to put the challenge back to our two speakers now very quickly. You've mentioned about the big changes, retail high street becoming a row of solicitors' offices. If you were the Oracle, how do you see our high streets in 5 to 10 years' time? So, Duncan.
I would say different, but not appallingly different, because I suspect in 12 to 18 months' time, the government will row back from these changes, and once they realise the damage that they can do.
Thank you. And Simon?
I think we'll see increased accentuation of differences between areas, those areas that are really struggling and those that people want to congregate in and are wealthy. And that's a risk. And I think we will have increased ad hoc, light touch, meanwhile type non-retail uses within high streets. Whether that's a good or bad thing is not for me to say.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I think you will all agree with me. We've had a stimulating and fascinating 1 hour. My thanks to our two speakers, Simon and Duncan of Town Legal. My thanks to all of you as well for taking part. We couldn't do it without your participation. But of course, we couldn't have done it without the help of Stephen and Olga. So thank you very much to both of you. I'm going to bid you all farewell, but please don't go just yet.